Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. And it's been sort of a crazy time for myself, and I'm sure for you also. I am in the position of having started this semester teaching a conventional course and halfway through being asked to convert it to an online course. I was also thinking that many people are probably in the identical position that I am, struggling with the technology. I'm fortunate in that the course that I'm teaching, I've taught online, and I've also taught it in a conventional manner, so I have a sense of what might need to be done. I'm also a social worker by training and not a technical person, so hopefully I can put myself in your shoes in trying to understand how to conduct your first live classroom. This will be a short presentation, perhaps 5 to 10 minutes. And I want to thank ABCT for sponsoring this video. So let's start off with a little bit of personal CBT. Some automatic thoughts I was having and you might be having is, one is I will fumble with this technology, and perhaps a rational response is, I have mastered PowerPoint, MS Word, Facebook, and truly doing an online class technically isn't any more complicated. Another automatic thought you might be having is my students will have a terrible course. A rational response could be my students will have a good enough course, and whatever you're doing, whether you're teaching in person, online, you still bring your caring, your expertise, and your teaching experience to the course. So a brief introduction about myself. I'm Daniel Beck. I'm a part-time faculty at the Boston University School for Social Work. I've been teaching there for 8 or 9 years, both in the online program and what they call the bricks and mortar program. In addition to that, I have a private practice here in Brookline, Massachusetts. All right, so what this presentation is going to cover. I'm not a technical person, and I'm not going to go over all the technical aspects of doing a live classroom. Hopefully your institution is providing some of that for you. What I am going to try to do is share some thoughts about managing the online classroom environment. You can conduct something that resembles a regular class, but there's some real differences too that I'd like to go over. In the sort of jargon of the online world, things are divided into synchronous and asynchronous activities. Asynchronous activities are things the students do on their own time, such as writing a paper, and synchronous activities are things like classroom, where everybody's there at the same time. In my classes, I use Zoom. I know there are other platforms out there. I believe most of them function in a similar way and have similar features. So a few thoughts before you go live. Perhaps you're doing your first online class sometime this week or next. As soon as you see this today, make sure your institution has set up your online classroom and given you and your students instructions about how to sign into the class. I would email your students several days in advance, do a little problem solving. Do they know how to sign on to the online classroom? Do they have any questions? If they do, get them to the right resources. Typically, I sign into my online class about 30 minutes in advance just to get set up. Assuming your institution is offering technical support, I want to connect with that person. If I've been instructed to record the session, I want to start recording it. There are various issues concerning your students' consent to be recorded. Check with your institution about that. I also want to open all the PowerPoints, Word documents, videos, whatever it is I might be showing during the video, during the live classroom, and make sure they're ready to go. So if your Zoom or other program works like mine, you'll sign on, your students will sign on, and what you'll see is a series of thumbnail videos. so-called Brady Bunch effect from those who are old enough to remember the TV show. You may have 5, 10, 15 or so students in little postage size videos. Some of your students, especially if they're away on break or still at home in places that have poor internet connection, might be on phone only. Try not to lose track of those students. My comments are primarily geared towards those who have a relatively small class, perhaps 18 students or less. If you're teaching a large class, 50 or 100 students, only some of my comments will be helpful for you. Another thing to be aware of is what you see on the screen and the order of these thumbnail sketches isn't necessarily exactly what your students will see. They may be in a different order. So a few thoughts on starting the class. The first thing I do is a technology check. I say, please raise your hand if you can hear and see me. Anybody who doesn't raise their hand, I'm going to connect them with technology support and make sure they're good to go. I have an agenda for the class. I'll go over this in a moment. For the class I'm going to do on this week, I'm probably going to allot a lot of time just for the following issue, talking about COVID-19. But typically, myself and my colleagues over-prepare. The live classroom goes quickly, and often I don't get to everything I intended to. So one thing I want to suggest is, let's start with the class with talking about the elephant in the room. I've been hearing from students this week. They have specific health concerns about COVID-19. They have unanswered questions about what this means for their classes, about what this means for their placement, what this means for their graduating on time. So given that they're physically disconnected from the university, I see part of my role is to connect them with the right person or resource who can answer their question. Also, there's a little bit of conflicting and missing information. Perhaps some of the students in the room have the answer to the questions that another student has. Let me talk about screen space. Screen space is of a premium. In the classes that I conduct, I put the highest value on discussion. And because of that, the majority of time is just going to be myself and the student videos in discussion talking. In order to cope with that, what I'll do is I'll send out in advance all the slides and other documents I'd like to have my students refer to and have those in front of them. I only share documents to take up the screen sparingly, sometimes not at all. Another thing to consider is when you share a document, you might not be able to see any of your students, or maybe perhaps not all of them. If you intend to show a video, in my experience, YouTube works okay. But if you're trying to show a video from a DVD or another source, there's the potential for it to be problematic. And given that this may be your first online course class, and if you decide to do nothing except have a discussion and not use any documents and any tools, you can still have a really great class. And I invite everyone just to start off slowly. A bit about encouraging discussion. This is perhaps the biggest difference between a conventional class and an online class. The students aren't looking at each other, and they don't have eye contact, and discussion can be a little stilted. One thing I do is I instruct my students about how to have a discussion, how to have their views known. And there's 3 ways of doing this. If you have particularly a small class, students can just speak when they're ready. You could also have students raise their hand when they'd like to be called on. Or you can use this raise your hand icon where you can see who would like to be called on. The bigger the class, the harder it is to manage, and the more likely I am to use the raise your hand icon. Another thing is whereas students might be a little more inhibited to speak than they would in a conventional class. To get around this, I just cold call students and I prepare them in advance for the fact that I might do that. Finally, instruct your students to use mute when they're not speaking. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of background noise. So some other features that are on Zoom and are also on other platforms. One is chat box. I think the best application of this is for short answer questions. So for example, at the start of class as a warm-up, I'll typically ask students to rate their mood from 1 to 10 and one sentence why. Given everything going on this week, I might actually skip that question this week. But typically I have some sort of warm-up question and have the students use the chat box for that. Most likely you have the ability to add a Word or other kind of document and alter it and as a matter of course during the discussion. An example of that might be, for instance, building an exposure hierarchy from a case example. There are many advanced features on Zoom, but you don't need to use them or even be familiar with them in order to have a great classroom. For example, I have the ability to break the class into smaller groups. Typically, I don't do that. It's fairly complicated. There are other features such as polling that I tend not to use. The features that I do tend to use are chat box, discussion, and on occasion, sharing documents. So some general advice. You know, a true online course like the one I designed takes weeks and weeks, and you're working one-on-one with an instructional designer. All of us are kind of caught off guard trying to do this halfway through the semester. So be cautious in your expectations of yourself in the class. What I intend to do is to change as little of the course as possible due to the law of unintended consequences. An example of that is I decided to do the students a favor and cut down the size of one of the assignments. It turns out that one of the students had already completed the assignment and was now unhappy because they had done all this extra work. So from here on out, I'm going to follow the syllabus as closely as I can. One of the few things that you might need to change in terms of doing your class online versus a regular class is it's much more difficult to do a small group discussion. So I tend to have discussions with the entire class. That's the end of my brief presentation. I wish everyone luck. And I'd like to thank the sponsor of my talk today, the Association of Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies. And if you are a member, I hope you will use the listserv in order to post additional questions. Thank you.